So talking about responsibility, I think, leads us on fairly seamlessly to talking about values, including ethics. So, in some ways we've already been discussing ethics, so the question of what we're responsible for is a pretty basic aspect of ethics. But another aspect of this is wider question, well, if we're going to try and make the best judgments we can, how do we know what the right judgment is to make? And that's obviously the central question of ethics. How do we do what's right, and how do we understand rightness or goodness or whatever we call it? So, I'm focusing on judgment here. As I previously explained, the middle way, that it's a principle of judgment. But obviously judgment involves, it's a whole interface between us and the situation. So if we make the best judgment possible, that's going to be because of our overall state, as well as the way we focus that state on the situation, and it's also got to be in relation to the situation and our understanding of it. So when we're making a judgment about values, the philosophers often distinguish different sorts of values, so prudential, moral, and aesthetic, for example. Now, I don't think the boundaries between these are terribly important. I'm not going to worry about them particularly. In a sense, I think all of these are ethical in a broad sense. But just some examples of these, just to show the range of things that involve value judgments. So a prudential thing would be making provision for ourselves in the future. So, do you brush your teeth? Do you have a pension scheme? These are kind of prudential decisions. So they're mainly focused on our future welfare. I would argue really there's no distinction between that and ethical decision making, because those decisions need to be weighed up with decisions about wider conditions and our response to them. Moral decisions, obviously, do you save that drowning child even if there's some risk to you? Do you give to that charity? All those sorts of judgments. But aesthetic judgments, very interestingly, are to do with basically to beauty and appreciation of that beauty. So, and they may often interact with moral decisions. So, not just is that painting better than that other painting, but also is that wood worth saving from that bypass. These are often involve aesthetic judgments. Now, there are a variety of ways in which in our society people make these decisions, these different kinds of principles to make value judgments. But what I'm going to argue is that whichever one of these ways of deciding you adopt, to follow it through really, you will need to adopt the middle way or use the middle way in the process. Perhaps you'll see what I mean as I go through with some examples of this. But to start with, just to briefly list some of the ways in which people typically judge values. So these are also ways in which philosophers have categorised value judgments. So you can judge on the basis of the consequences of your actions, and very often that goes with the idea that you should try and produce more pleasure and less pain. So it's a utilitarian type approach to decision making, that you try and bring about the best outcomes. And this is very often the way, in fact, for example, that people make decisions these days in organisations. They try and keep everybody as happy as possible, avoid painful outcomes for people in society, whether those are measured financially or clinically in healthcare or whatever it is. But that's not the only basis that people have for such decisions. There's also consistent principles or rational principles. In philosophical terms, this is what's known as Kantian ethics. So where you have a principle which you think it's important to keep in order to be rationally consistent, particularly in relation to yourself and others, so you don't treat yourself as an exception to the rule that you're following. So, for example, you might avoid dropping litter yourself because you don't like the idea of other people dropping litter. and it will be inconsistent of you to do that while you disapprove of other people doing that. So if you make a decision on those sorts of lines, doing as you would be done by, for example, following the golden rule as it's sometimes described, then that's also about consistency and following principles. There's also the need to develop virtues. That is what you might more broadly in modern terms perhaps describe as self-improvement or self-development. So John was talking about this earlier in the treatise, one of his motivations for being here. So, very often that's one reason why people come on retreat, because the focus on retreat is very much on moving oneself on in some way or changing one's habits in some way. Then there are the conventions or commands of the group, let's say group expectations or social expectations. So, obviously a lot of the time we do make our judgments according to what we think other people expect, or perhaps that's been formalised in a set of rules or laws of some kind. Then there are, of course, religious motivations, so what we believe the commands of God to be in some cases, or the commands of some other religious authority, which people sometimes follow. Or there's the pursuit of beauty, particularly in aesthetic judgments, that if you're deciding which work of art to buy or which garden to save or whatever it is, it may be on the basis of your experience of beauty. Okay, now so that gives us, to be working on that 6 different ways of thinking about value judgments. Now, it's not necessarily a complete list, but it's enough to be going on with. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that all of these things are part of people's experience. So you could take any of these ways of making value judgments, and they're all important to people in different ways. And obviously, avoiding pleasure and consequences are often important to us in immediate terms or in further away terms. And principles and virtues are important parts of our experience. We can't get away from the fact that we're social animals, that we worry about what other people think about us and the expectations of the group. And beauty and, in some cases, religious experience can be part of our experience as well. So, I'm not going to say any of these approaches are wrong, but I would say that when you absolutise any of them, they turn into a problem. So the ethical difficulties start to arise when you take a principle from any of these and say, this is absolutely valid and it overturns all of the others in this case, so we must rigidly stick to this principle in this case. You turn it in effect into a metaphysical rule, which then leads you to neglect what experience tells you about other things, about the other sort of factors that might influence your choices. So, that's if we take these one by one and also think, how could we adopt this approach, but do so in relation to the middle way, and what would be the effects if we do? Because my argument is also that to fulfill really any of the directions in which any of these are going, we need the middle way. So in the first case, the utilitarian kind of approach, the consequential approach, let's suppose your goal is to produce pleasure or happiness, perhaps for yourself, perhaps for others. Now, I'm going to suggest that, the big limitation of that is that our idea of what we want, or the pleasures or happiness that we want, is liable to be limited if we just base it on our judgment at this particular moment and representation we might have in our left hemispheres at this moment, that this is what will be pleasurable for me, or this is what might avoid a terrible pain for me or for others. So the more integrated our understanding of those consequences, the better those sorts of judgments are going to be. So the problem with this kind of approach, narrowly focused, is that people forget the fallibility of their judgments. So people, for example, might make big decisions, like, say, the Three Gorges Dam or something like this, which are based on certain factors that are taken into account when they make the decision, but they neglect others. So they're not taking into account other things, which may come up later, or awareness of which may have been repressed at that point. So if you're going to be, in a sense, if you're going to be a thoroughgoing utilitarian and really consider the consequences, you need to pursue integration in order to make those judgments better, to take into account not just what you think is going to happen as a result of your actions, but the limitations in your decision-making process.
There's a good story here during the Iraq War, or just before the Iraq War. Donald Rumsfeld famously threw a huge dossier compiled by several experts just in the bin, because his view of the consequences was a lot narrower. He wasn't prepared to look at a wider range of conditions.
Yep, exactly. So that's a good example of assessment of consequences very narrowly construed. Yeah.
And is there then an opposite dichotomous view to consequentialism? Then is it?
Oh well, there's not taking consequences into account at all. Yeah. So
Right.
I mean, if you take let's take the official Catholic view about contraception or something like that. You should follow the principles of natural law, which require you not to use contraception, whatever the consequences of that might be, even if that results, for example, in the spread of HIV in developing countries as a result of people being discouraged from using condoms. That's a complete neglect of the consequences, where experience actually makes it clear what the consequences are. So yeah, rejecting consequences is just as dogmatic as being rigidly wedded to just a particular conception of what the consequences will be, or which consequences are important.
And is there a name for that sort of theory or not?
Well, there's utilitarianism. There are other forms of consequentialism as well, but
if non-consequentialism, then
let's call it neglect of consequences. I mean,
right. It's not.
But that's liable to be related to one of the other things on the list, taken positively as well. But or if going down to the consistent use of principles, or the Kantian approach, that again, if you're going to be really consistent in your principles, then it seems again that you need to take into account the limitations of the way you have formulated or understood those principles. So you may think, as Kant did, that you found the universal rules. He thought that it was naturally and always wrong, for example, to commit suicide. He thought he'd discovered an absolute rule on those grounds just through reason, but in judging that, he was making certain assumptions which may be wrong. So if we're going to take that into account, the fact that our thinking about principles may be wrong, we need to try and integrate that thinking. So we need to take into account the limitations of our judgment about these things.
Didn't he also, he had an absolute view about lying, that lying was always wrong, and he made this point that if the murderer came to your door with a knife and asked where your son was, you would have to tell him, because lying's wrong.
So those were his principles, and I thought which is a categorical imperative, was his one and only principle, but he had other principles.
Well, he derived those from the categorical imperative.
Oh, okay.
So in some cases he thought the categorical imperative was unambiguous in providing us with certain naturally true principles. He thought we could derive from the categorical imperative.
Okay.
Well, see, that's the problem. I mean, that there are some occasions when you can apply Kantian thinking in a way which does seem to fit experience much better. So like my earlier example of dropping litter, if we can challenge ourselves with things like that, why are you making an exception of yourself in this sort of case? And often there will be a link there. When we make points like that, there'll be other reasons we could give as well. What's the consequences of dropping litter, whatever. But it's one way in which we can challenge ourselves to move that a little way beyond from can to ought, to stretch ourselves a little bit, morally speaking. So then going on to virtues. So it is possible, although it's a good thing to develop virtues, develop spiritual qualities and so on, one could get fixated on it in a narrow way. And, you could spend the rest of your life on retreat, for example, and really turn yourself into what you consider a perfect person and not address the wider conditions at all, if you were in a position to do that. And I think that would be pretty questionable, really. There were going to be conflicts between what people regard as virtuous in different contexts, and even with different kinds of groups that hold retreats will have different views about what we're trying to do on a retreat. And there'll be some Catholic retreats, for example, where we're focused much more on understanding the commands of God and repressing our feelings about them in some way. So basically, in order to develop virtues more thoroughly, we're going to have to address conflicts which might arise between different virtues or their application. And if we're going to address those conflicts, we're going to have to look at the wider conditions. It's not just our own virtues, or even possibly the virtues of other people who we might help along with their development, the wider world.
Isn't there also more of a long-term aspect to developing virtues? Because there's this assumption that a virtuous person makes the right decision by virtue of being a virtuous person.
Indeed.
But this takes time.
Sure, yeah. So just developing virtues might help you to make better decisions, but it won't tell you what to decide. Then you need some kind of principles or guidelines to work with in order to think your way through, in the particular situation, what's the right judgment to make here.
So, and then again, what is there a dichotomous view to virtue ethics that you'd say?
Well, again, the complete neglect of virtues. So you get, for example, some utilitarians who just apparently don't think at all about themselves as judgment makers and how their own states of mind, for example, might influence their judgments.
It's purely a balance sheet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, and so obviously, to develop virtues better, we also need to not make an absolute of virtues, but to take into account these other ways of making judgments. Group expectations. Obviously, if you just follow group expectations, you can become, at worst, some kind of group zombie. But you can certainly narrow your view of the world because you don't question the assumptions the group has made, which may be wrong assumptions, and the cultural limitations of that. So whether that's the obvious classic case is say Nazi Germany, but even a more moderate example, there were limitations to the English culture or middle class assumptions or whatever.
But it's wrong to totally neglect group expectations.
Indeed, yeah. If we pretend that we're not part of the group or fail to recognise our own degree of dependence on the group, then that's what can result in individualism, which normally has a repressed group element to it, which can come back again. So individualists form groups of individualists, sort of punk bands or something who are different from the society, but actually they're a group of punks. There's in order to, in a sense, fulfil group expectations better in the long term in a sustainable way, you need to integrate the group. So you need to be able to critically compare those group expectations with wider ones and with other principles or values. So that can take us to the whole question of integrating groups and what that means, which I'll talk a bit more about tomorrow, because it raises political questions as well. Then there's the commands of God. Now that's an interesting one, I think, because a few days ago I was talking about the difference between an experience of the meaning of God and beliefs about God. And so I think the same thing applies here. So if somebody has what they believe to be, or what they experience as God, and then believe to be or interpret as God, there's a point which is often difficult to pin down, but there's a point where they pass from one to the other, from the experience to the belief. And obviously, when people have the experience, there's a way in which, I think it's William James that describes religious experience as wholly authoritative over people. That they feel it's overwhelming. They feel like they need to operate in relation to this overwhelming experience. And possibly the reason for that, I suspect, is that it can be a temporary experience, often an experience of temporary integration. So it's a powerful experience that, and perhaps the more powerful that experience, the more genuinely it can convey values that are values of integration, so values that would actually help us to address conditions better. So perhaps that's the question we can ask, that if our experience of God is one of an integrated state, that may actually offer experiences which help us to judge values better. But if, however, you've just had what you're labelling as an experience of God, which may not be that integrated in fact, it may just have the label attached to it, and turn that into a dogma, that's not it's not going to help you very much with objectivity or helping you to address conditions. In fact, it's very likely to lead you in the other direction, because you're going to give an absolute justification to what is actually a very partial experience and a very partial understanding of how you ought to act.
Well, so the middle way isn't just choosing 5 of the 10 commandments.
No, indeed not. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So, obviously, something that somebody takes as a command of God has to be taken with a pinch of salt, I think, in every case. But I just want to make the point that people may have experiences which help them to understand value judgments in some ways, more subtle ways. Then there's the pursuit of beauty one. And again, I think also that the general point applies here, that the more integrated this is, the more helpful it might actually be in addressing conditions. So the experience of beauty, well, if you think about what gives us an experience of beauty, it's very often how integrated we are, particularly at the point we have that experience. So, if there's a wonderful example that a friend of mine once gave of walking along, I think it was in the East End, and he'd been meditating quite intensively, so he was in quite a temporarily strongly integrated state as a result. And he saw this corrugated iron fence flapping in the wind, and he had a sublime experience of beauty. This corrugated iron fence was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. So it depends very much on how you are in looking at it, and obviously, if you're not in a very integrated state and you pass these wonderful roses in the garden, you probably won't give them a second glance, or you certainly won't appreciate what they have to offer. So it's not to say that the experience of beauty has nothing to do with what may be out there, but just that we can make a difference to it. So perhaps the more integrated our actual experience of beauty, the more integrated our perceptions, the more we're getting closer to something which might help to guide us in our judgments. So again, we can ask that question, how integrated is it? Is it just an idea of beauty that we sort of plastered onto the experience, or is it an indicator of our states of mind? So I'd have respect, somebody who wants to defend a beautiful place, for example, because it's beautiful. I'd be very sceptical about if they absolutise that idea of the beauty that they think they're saving and put it above all else. But if it's something that they've really experienced, then I think that's worth taking into account along with these other things. But it's not just going to override everything else.
Because the left brain view of beauty often then becomes acquisitive, doesn't it?
Indeed, yeah. Collecting beautiful objects and so on. So if we try and pull this together, it brings us to the question, how do we apply the middle way to moral judgments? And I think basically it involves not taking any one principle or any one way of judging values absolutely, but looking for that sort of often unclear, unavoidably unclear line of sustainable responsibility somewhere in between them, between either accepting or denying any of these approaches. And the taking of any of these approaches to extremes, there are some cases where you can identify cognitive biases which are related to this. So there's one that you might call the hedonic treadmill, which I think Martin mentioned earlier in the tweet at some point. We're talking about that, yeah? Do you want to say
No.
The hedonic treadmill is where you're seeking pleasure, that's what hedonic is. But the more you seek it, the less you actually get it. So you're in a self-negating cycle, in a sense. Particularly just in the experience of pleasure itself. So the more of that pleasure you experience, the less pleasurable it becomes. So like the smoker who starts off with this wonderful experience of this new tobacco, but the more they smoke it, the more normalised it becomes and the less exciting.
But the more craving he has for it, 'cause he's looking more and more
Absolutely,
for it.
yeah.
So
Yep. So you're
running faster.
you're
and faster.
hooked, yeah. Obviously that's the experience of drug addicts very often, I gather, as well. Yeah. So the sort of absolutisation of the pursuit of pleasure, the idea that pleasure is a good thing to make the basis of your judgments and try and figure it out, as a self-destructive aspect to that, or a contradictory aspect to that in experience. And another example of this is the just world hypothesis. So the belief that people can have that the world is just in some way. So if the world does something against what they deserve, or gives them what they don't feel they deserve, so in my case, say I can't get this book published, and but I ought to get it published. It's a good book, so I deserve to get it published. But so I feel something wrong here, and there's that sort of a basic principle of how things are has been contravened. But if you get into that sort of state, then you're just not addressing conditions. There's some things going on which are in fact stopping this idea of justice, which is purely my idea of justice, rather than something that's out there from coming to pass.
But then I suppose the other extreme is people, when you sort of say, oh, it's, the world isn't fair, it's just not fair, life isn't fair, but life isn't always unfair, is it?
Indeed, absolutely, yeah. So there's a psychologist who's written a book about this, which I found very interesting, called Melvin Lerner, I think his name is. And the opposite of the just world hypothesis, I think he called the cut the crap, it's a tough world out there hypothesis.
American, perhaps?
Yes. So obviously that can be linked to sort of consistent principles, or maybe the command of God, if you think God makes the world just kind of approach, or indeed to an absolute belief in nature, that nature will make everything okay, maybe in karmic balance or stuff like that. So just to close then with a few points about practice, as I try to do with each one. So how can we use this stuff? In a sense, it's all about practice, isn't it? But I think one thing is to have confidence, actually, in an approach that we've adopted. Once we've considered that there is a way in which we need to make judgments, and that this is based on experience. So have confidence in a principle grounded in experience. And I've talked previously about how that confidence itself, if it's genuine confidence, can actually take into account criticisms and difficulties better than the sort of more fragile overconfidence that you might get from a dogmatic belief that you're just imposing on the world. So if you've got one of these ways of judging, and it works in the circumstances that you've experienced and in the evidence that you've taken into account, perhaps from elsewhere, then you need to run with it. So like with this retreat, I tried to base it on my previous experience of what I thought worked on retreats, but I've also tried to adapt to the circumstances or new conditions that I became aware of in the process. And then I suppose the flip side of that is that it is necessary to challenge absolutisations of any of these ethical approaches. And obviously that's a big deal. I mean, we in practice, we can't always fruitfully challenge them. If they're part of an organisation of which we're a very small element, it's very, very difficult to do things to challenge what we might regard as dogmatic principles of judgment that will work there. But sometimes we are in a position to do so, and for it to have some effect. And obviously you have to pick your moment when you're challenging anything, as to if the people you're talking to are ready to receive what you have to say. But yes, but it could be any of those things we discussed. That it's not just that it's wrong to base your judgments on commands from God, for example. It's anything can be absolutised, basically. That's I think the main thing I want to bring up. Okay, shall I'll stop there and see if there's any thoughts on this.
I think for me, one of what you've come up in the past, which has been very helpful for me in regard to this, is seeing all these ways of approaching ethics as tools in your ethical toolbox, and so you're faced with a certain situation. At times, a principle might be the best one to adopt, and you always view that in a provisional way. But sometimes a more utilitarian or consequential approach might be a better option in that situation, or even potentially a combination of the two at times. Or that's a helpful idea to have in my head.
Yeah, that's it's. I suppose I'm reminded actually the other day where I suggested in walking meditation, if you're walking slowly and it's not working, then try walking faster. And I suppose it's just that variation, looking at different approaches it's like or another analogy would be trying out different sizes of screwdriver with this screw or whatever. You're just seeing what works in whatever circumstances it is.
If you only have one tool in your toolbox and you apply it absolutely, can you then be held responsible for your judgment?
Well, to some degree, yep. But there's a person who's making that judgment, isn't there? And that judgment of responsibility. And so, if you're going to make that judgment, whether it's about yourself or about somebody else, in as fair a way as possible, it needs to be a matter of degree. Yeah.
But if you're locked in your left hemisphere as an absolute person and absolutely applying this rule, it's as if there's no freedom to do otherwise.
Well, I think I disagree that these people with these views are embodied. They don't have other things going on. They have other options. So
only if they wake up to them,
Yeah, in practice, yeah. So
they
may be vanishingly small.
Yeah. And I kind of point, if you're not mindful, this isn't open to you in a way. You have to be mindful to engage with this at all. I suppose it's like saying you have to be integrated to be integrated.
Yeah. So there are situations where people are very deeply into a dogmatic mindset, but that doesn't mean that they don't have experiences which might lever them slightly away from that mindset. And I think it's very likely they will, because they're constantly going to encounter conditions which challenge it, which perhaps they're inclined to block off or repress. Some of it's going to get in from time to time, and they're going to have to keep batting it away, and maybe the glimmer of possibility, the authentic possibilities, is going to occur to them.
So perhaps if you took an example of, say, someone who's decided to take on the mission of being a suicide bomber, then that may be because of absolutising a command of God type ethic, but then presumably they would come up against some other thoughts or feelings about it, perhaps a fear of death or sadness about leaving their loved ones behind, or maybe worry that some people might get caught up in it that they don't want to be caught up in it. So that might be a sort of example where there are that they're sort of maybe not responsible for the indoctrination into that belief, but I think from what you're saying, that they've got other things going on that they could choose to follow and sort of expand on. Would that be a good example? Yeah,
I mean, I often use the analogy of trees in a forest as regards trying to understand the role that metaphysical beliefs play in our whole mental setup. So it may be for some people that if you think of the metaphysical beliefs as a certain type of tree which is trying to grow faster than the other trees and block out the sunlight for them, those trees may be dominant for the moment, but that doesn't mean there aren't other trees in the forest. In fact, there are bound to be, because these people are also having everyday experiences and responding in practical ways to things at the same time. So, it doesn't mean that some of those great trees might not fall over in a storm, or other trees might have the chance to grow up and gain more predominance as time goes on.
It's back to that story I was telling the other day about Joseph Mengele, that he would give sweets to children or offer kindnesses to them, and then he would later amputate their arm or give them typhus or whatever. That was his. He had a very limited view of the personhood of these children, but that absolute view he had to repress the other stuff, but it would come out. That he wasn't just, that was the dominant tree in his forest, but there were other trees there too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think my question with this values thing is it just down to you to decide which ones matter more to you? So, for instance, if we look at the ones that you said earlier, prudential, moral, aesthetic, and then used an example of HS2, the big train from London to Birmingham or wherever. Like they're obviously focused on the future welfare, like or the future economic welfare of the country. They say that will bring economic prosperity. But then in terms of the aesthetics, the appreciation of beauty, of all that land that's going to be sort of dug up and whatever for that train service to go in. Are they made like? Well, I don't know if they would have necessarily had these thoughts, but they're making a value judgment that economic prosperity is more valuable than the beauty of the land that they're digging up, and is that acceptable in the middle way? And also, who is it? Well, is it okay to in any other part of your life to make that decision and to decide which value you care about more or less?
Well, I don't think you could stipulate in advance, that prudential judgments are better, more important than aesthetic ones or anything of that kind.
Right.
But you could look at that specific case of HS2 and form a judgment about it. But I think one of the factors involved there, because it's a political decision, is this takes us into the whole question of the integration of groups, but that how integrated is that judgment? So how much of the possible challenges, has it taken into account the other points of view about it? Has it taken into account? How much has the government listened to the people? How coherent is the government itself in its attitudes and its policy to this? So to some people it then seems clear that the economic imperatives should rule, and to others then it seems clear that it's not worth the cost for the amount of destruction that will take place. And, I can't say I personally have a strong view about that, but I think you need to. The key thing here, that the difference that the middle way could make in those sorts of decisions is just to help people to be aware of the alternatives. That there isn't just one principle they need to apply to solve the problem, or indeed one principle to apply to prove that the people who made the judgment were wrong. It's more that they're less likely to make an effective decision if they don't take into account the different voices that might be raised in relation to it.
So therefore, do you think that the middle way correlates nicely with sustainable development as a sort of concept in terms of social, environmental and economic ideas always being taken into account in any sort of development opportunity? So it's sort of...
Very often, I think, yeah.
Sustainability is always right?
I wouldn't say that, no. but
what occasions is it not?
Yeah.
I think that's an important part where Robert says very often, and you have to be careful not to say that the middle way has always this position or that position on everything. What the middle way is a method for you, with all the variables in your experience, to come to an integrated judgment that relates to your experience. And those judgments tend to be more integrated than others are, but not that the middle way itself has this position on or that position on things, as something out there. I don't know.
Yeah, but at the same time, I would suggest that sustainability very often
fits
the middle way.
Very often, yeah.
Indeed. And there are reasons for that. In that the left. Think about the time blindness of the left hemisphere. That we tend to identify with positions that are about the short term, that are about our understanding of things at the moment and the immediate things that strike us at the moment. But sustainability is often about recognising the long-term effects of our actions. And by doing that, you're taking into account the other possible factors that might arise at other times, even into the far future. So if you're thinking about the effects on the environment in the longer term, that's basically a good way of opening up one's dogmatic assumptions sometimes, I think, just to think about, well, is this sustainable? It's a good question to ask.
So another example to look at in terms of how the middle way might be to approach it, thinking of the badger cull. And there's obviously people who consider it wrong to kill badgers, but there's also people on the other side who think that whether or not their assessment is correct that badgers are responsible for spreading TB, they seem to have, become entrenched in the idea that killing badgers is a necessity, and perhaps then blinkered to information that either doesn't support that view, or and also evidence that approach isn't actually proving effective. So how would you approach those two sides from a middle way point?
Well, I try and understand both sides of the argument. In this particular case, I agree with you on the basis of my own assessment that the government's case was very weak and seemed to be based on the vested interests of the farmers more than anything else. But also actually the farmers' limited view of their own interests to some degree. This is all tied in with wider issues like livestock farming and the unsustainability of that practice in terms of the wider global environment. So in some ways you can't necessarily just look at these issues in isolation if you're going to look at them sustainably. And one of the effects of dogmatic approaches is to create these kinds of limitations of attention. So like in the talk on the first day, I talked about these that we set up strong boundaries, and that those itself can be metaphysical beliefs. The beliefs that there are boundaries about what we should look at, and we're only going to look at, in this case, the question of what causes TB in cattle, which itself is highly disputable, but what would be the best way of tackling it? But there's also a wider question, why are we keeping so many cattle in the first place?
Exactly.
But and why is it so important to defend the economic interests of farmers that we're prepared to slaughter badgers in order to do that? I think they need to ask those questions.
And I also see very little. It's been very hard to find any consideration of the wider impact of killing out badgers, because they are really the top predator that we have left in the ecosystems in this country. And so that is going to have an impact on that ecosystem. We don't know what impact it's going to have, and that could be one that proves to be equally negative or even more so for farmers. We don't know, so it does seem a little bit short-sighted as well.
This goes back to what Robert was saying about consequentialism. Its potential drawback is you make a judgment about possible outcomes, but certainly the wider issue that you choose, there's so much more variables involved. I think as a general thing, consequential approach can work better the tighter the time frame, or the tighter the issue. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Yeah, it does, because obviously there are occasions when we have to make quick decisions, and particularly actually if you're an official of some kind or you're making decisions on behalf of other people, you've got a responsibility in a social sense to you're given that responsibility to make that decision. Then very often what you have to focus on is the consequences of the decision in that context. So I think that's one reason why public policy does seem to be generally improving, because it's more often than it used to be based on consideration of consequences. And even things like voluntary euthanasia, which until quite recently were based on religious principles. Or the legal position was the decisions the government had made about it were based on religious principles. But even that, there's now a real discussion about whether we should be focusing more on consequences. So things have been gradually shifting, but it can also be too narrow, the focus on consequences, I think, on occasion. and particularly that the government is inclined to neglect things like virtue and sort of the development of individuals and the need to support that, because it does make a big difference to a lot of things governments are interested in, like healthcare and indeed education.
Mm.
So, I mean, do you think it's feasible to work in this kind of way in your experience when making decisions? Can it be related to experience sufficiently?
I mean, I can see how the principles work in practice then, as if you're shifting the whole thing then back into the left hemisphere to do all these calculations to then come up with a decision.
Why is that so?
Because we want to put more integrated, how we apply these, different tools. But to actually apply them, you then have to use kind of rational thought and kind of logic, which is kind of a left brain function, and then put it back. You know what I mean? It's
well, I think in a sense all of the discussion we've had is left brain function, but the question is not so much just whether we're using the left hemispheres as whether how well that left hemisphere is connected to a wider perspective. So, I mean, another way of putting it is, are we using synthesis as well as analysis? So if you're just using analysis, you're assuming a certain picture and just working out what that implies. Which is if you're doing a narrow utilitarian decision, for example, that's what you do. You'd say, well, there's this set of facts, and we've got these goals that we're trying to bring about. So how do we fit those together? But synthesis is saying, well, what can we take into account here, or what should we take into account here? And that involves the right hemisphere. You've got to connect the right hemisphere in order to get a perspective on those different models or different views that you might have, and connect them to each other. And so that's what I feel is very much lacking in, it's very much lacking in academic philosophy at the moment, but also academic life in general, that there's a lot of analytic thought, very specialised analytic thinking, which is obviously tied to scientific investigation, but it's very often not joined up. People don't think about how it connects with other specialisations, the wider assumptions being made.
I think one way where the Buddhist tradition works quite well is in its, I'm generalising it, but in its attitude towards principles, that it treats them as precepts generally or guidelines, so they're provisional by nature rather than when you in the monotheistic religions you tend to find the rules to be a lot more absolute, like the Ten Commandments or whatever.
And the decision that you come out with at the end of the day of all of this is still provisional, isn't it? It's still, because it's easy to then say, well, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You have to know, you never can be sure you've made the right decision.
Yeah, but
never say, judge that you have.
But at the same time, you have to act. So at the time that you act, you have to decide, well, this is the best decision I can make in these circumstances. Then you act on it, and then you wait for the next decision.
But it's easy to fall back and think, killing the badgers is the right thing to do, not the right thing to do. Having weighed it all up, you still have to realise,
are you going to kill the badgers or not? Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that seems to have got into the scenario where, because it's almost being done because it was decided to do, and it's sort of to reinforce that position rather than to have to do a U-turn.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a fallacy, isn't it? The sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, I'll talk more about that on Friday when I'll be talking about time, but it's one of the fallacies that certainly is a problem, particularly for governments, that because you've made a decision in the past, there's a tendency to stick with not just that decision, but also what you've invested in it. So there's money, there's time, there's attention, and so on, and political credibility sunk into that decision. So to reverse it is obviously embarrassing and difficult. But that can apply to us as individuals as well.
It's like you buy a house and you overspend on it, and it doesn't tick all the boxes for you, but because you put so much money into it, you carry on, or a car or whatever,
or a course of some sort of learning where you've got so far into it, and you spend a lot of money, you put a lot of effort into it, and do you recognise this really isn't what I wanted it to be, or it's taking more time, or some reason why you don't want to continue, but then you sort of don't want to waste what you've already invested, so you think, well, maybe I'll just plod on and get to the end, at least then I get a credit for it or something,
I do find this useful, this thing that you mentioned the other day. A lot of it's awareness of these cognitive biases, because you've just got them in there in your awareness, and you notice them, you're doing them, it just at least makes you think twice about them a little bit, that this thing that you're doing might be deluded to some degree,